Hi, this is Gus Wachowski, and in this video we're going to be looking at many of the events that are going to be highly pivotal in terms of leading toward colonial unity against the British Crown. Now keep in mind at this point, at the time of this of many of these key events, you've just fought the French and Indian War, and keep in mind a lot of the colonists still identify with England in many ways. They have a similar court structure. They are also English men and women themselves, many of them. They're carrying many of the practices and customs, as well as Protestantism, with them to the colonies. So, it's not like it's going to be an automatic, let's just break off from Britain. You're going to even have loyalists who are loyal to the British colony, even on the eve of the American Revolutionary War. And we're talking 20-30% on average still sided with the British Crown when the American Revolutionary War started. So again, by no means do you have unity, and will you ever have unity, but certainly that's going to build up. So let's first start off with French and Indian War in terms of how that set up a major problem. As you know, the colonists fought alongside the British. They defeat the French and the Native Americans. Natives are pushed farther west. And you have growing hostilities with Native Americans. And as a result, you have an alliance of Native Americans under Pontiac's alliance who are going to be rebelling and going after any of the settlers, particularly the colonists, who are going west of the Appalachians. So, of course, the royal colony is going to try to prevent these hostilities by enacting the Proclamation of 1763. Which was very unenforceable, but the colonists are going to have a big problem with that. They feel like, hey, we sided with the British. We should reap the fruit of our labors. And you're telling us now we can't go west? We want to know what's west. So this is going to begin to foster some discontent amongst the colonists. And just to show you the extent to which you have a lot of curiosity, and you have a lot of land claims west of the Proclamation line, as you see in this little red dotted area, which more or less follows the Appalachian Mountains. You have Georgia extending all the way up to the Mississippi River. You have land claims by Virginia and Massachusetts in the north, even as far north as Virginia. I mean, this shows you that a lot of these colonies are very, very much interested in moving west. They want to know what's out there, and now you're having the Crown tell them, no, you're not allowed to. We want to prevent any hostilities. We want to prevent future rebellions and future attacks, but of course the colonists are ignoring this as they go west of that border. So you have a problem there. You also have colonists who are very much upset, and at this point, they are somewhat, disunited. Even with the French and Indian War, when this cartoon was one of the more infamous ones created by Ben Franklin, and it not only takes on meaning during the French and Indian War, in which Franklin is going to advocate that the colonies have to be, connected and united, sort of like this snake, otherwise it's going to die, as you know, from New England down to South Carolina. Hence, join or, die as a result of the Native Americans. This is going to take on a new type of theme, particularly when we get into the American Revolutionary War. So at this point, the colonies are not entirely united. But one thing that's going to unite them a little bit more is a crackdown on smuggling with the Navigation Acts. You're going to see that the British can now search any ship or building. And keep in mind, after the French and Indian War, Great Britain has a humongous debt problem. You have a humongous army stationed in the colonies. The colonists are even feeling threatened. And on top of that, to add insult into injury, the British want the colonists to pay for the protection in the French and Indian War. Now remember, the British thought the colonists did pretty terribly. I mean, to an extent, I guess you could say that, George Washington was defeated. But on the flip side, the colonists were not very impressed with the British. If you recall, the British suffered some very early setbacks by the French. It's not really until you have General Pitt of the British Army that's going to launch that surprise attack that eventually becomes a turning point. But nevertheless, you have George Grenville being appointed as the financial expert in the British Prime Minister in order to enact a financial way to exact some money from the colonies. And one of the earliest ones is going to be the Sugar Act of 1764. And the other problem with this is that the prosecutors can try smuggling cases in vice admiralty courts instead of a colonial court. So why is this big? Colonial courts would oftentimes acquit the colonists, even though they were really violating many of the acts and smuggling. But since they were made up of colonists of a jury, now this takes the hands out of any colonist courts, and it puts them with a judge without a jury. So, of course, that's going to foster some content. So, that's going to be problematic. We'll come back to these images in a moment. Of course, they are going to be leading up to the discontent and unifying. I mean, what unifies different colonies together? A common enemy. So, some of the following acts are going to be British attempts at the colonies to pay for the French and Indian War. It is expensive to fight wars, especially when you are the largest empire, which the sun does not set, and you have troops that are going to be stationed in the 13 colonies. So one of the other earlier acts is going to be the Stamp Act. This is a direct act in 1765. So we're talking any legal document. We're talking newspapers, pamphlets, advertisements, and this is the first direct tax on particular goods that would be paid by people in the colonies, as opposed to when they're being imported. And this becomes highly unpopular, as you would imagine. Think about how paper and legal documents are constantly being used, especially newspapers, in terms of being purchased. So you're going to have a lot of resistance. In particular, you're going to have the Sons of Liberty, who were known for some of their more violent tactics, tarring and feathering. And then you, of course, had your more benign ones being boycotting. That's going to unite colonies, refusing to participate and pay the tax on these particular goods. And so as a result, you're going to have the Stamp Act eventually overturned. But the British government is going to say, well, okay, we'll overturn the Stamp Act, but we're going to pass something known as the Declaratory Act, that we have the right to make any law that we see fit. So even though this is, certainly a step in the right direction for the British, at the same time, you're going to note that the British is going to try to reassert themselves. Also on top of that, the Quartering Act of 1765, the colonists are going to be ordered to house soldiers. And that is why we have the Third Amendment. Some, refer to the Third Amendment as one of the more irrelevant ones, particularly today. But nevertheless, during this time, at the devising of the Constitution, only about 20 plus years later, it was very relevant for them to include that in the Third Amendment. It may not be so relevant in the 21st century, but maybe that's debatable. You also, following the Stamp Act, the Declaratory Act, the Quartering Act, have the Townshend Act. And this is an indirect tax on glass, lead, paint, paper, also a 3-penny tax on tea. And as you would imagine, you have colonists who are going to be boycotting. They're going to be protesting. And they're going to be substituting goods whenever they are able to do so. One other part about this is that the Townshend Acts are going to allow for the search of private homes for when goods have been suspected of being smuggled. So there's no real need for a search warrant. And again, you could also think about why the Fourth Amendment is going to be included eventually when the colonists devise the Constitution. So 4,000 troops are going to be stationed in in Boston rather. And here you see a burning of an effigy by the colonists. And again, just keep in mind the Sons of Liberty, this sort of secretive group that's going to be taking charge. And they're going to be harassing tax collectors. They're going to be tarring and feathering them. I mean, they use some pretty violent tactics. Some even go so far as even calling them the first terrorists. Certainly from an American view, we don't necessarily view the Sons of Liberty in that way, but they are destroying goods. They are going after tax collectors. So some do have that more, radical-ish view, if you will. Another major key event is going to be the Boston Massacre. The thing about the Boston Massacre, it's not a massacre. You have colonists and soldiers actually fighting over jobs. The soldiers were actually very, ill-paid, and they're looking for other jobs, and they're competing with the colonists, and that becomes a problem. So you have one winter's night on March 5th, 1770, and the colonists are stirring up trouble. They're throwing rocks and throwing snowballs at the British soldiers, and you have a number of colonists killed. And this is going to turn the public against the British for a number of reasons. Certainly, it's problematic that the British soldiers are killing these colonists, but even more problematic for the British is how Paul Revere is actually going to depict the Boston Massacre. It's really not a massacre. 5 colonists are are shot dead. And remember, the colonists were sort of the agitators of this, but not from this depiction. This is a nice piece of propaganda here. As you see, almost the British soldiers are lining up as if it's being orchestrated here, and they're just shooting these helpless colonists, when in fact that really is not the case. You see the blood here, and it was even said that this dog was going to be licking up the wounds of the colonists. So certainly propaganda appeals to the emotions, not so much the intellect, but this would be something that's circulated amongst the colonies, fostering more discontent. And think about sort of that join or die cartoon that was meant for the French and Indian War. Now it's going to be regaining a little bit new meaning as we approach the American Revolutionary War. In addition, you're going to see the Townshend Acts also going to be repealed, similar to the Stamp Act. So, once again, we have another event, probably you've heard of it, the Boston Tea Party, December 16th, 1773. And this is a protest of the Tea Act. Interestingly enough, this was an attempt to give the British East India Company a monopoly on the tea trade. And as a result, you're going to see the colonists dressing up as Native Americans, saying that, and one of the reasons why they dress up as Native Americans, interestingly enough, is to say that, this is uniquely American, that they were uniquely American, almost saying that they're not Englishmen anymore. And again, fostering this idea of getting closer to, independence. And you see people cheering here, but it wasn't universally accepted. Some saw the destruction of the chests of tea being thrown into the Boston Harbor as really a dangerous act because they're destroying property. If you think back to the Enlightenment, Locke, who was one of the major influencers of the Declaration of Independence as well as our U.S. Constitution, going to say the protection of property is very important. So some actually saw this as very radical, the colonists, believe it or not. But nevertheless, you do see some here being depicted, being very happy and elated about that. And in today's financial terms, the destruction was roughly about $1 million plus in damages, if you were going to use 21st century, money, if you will. So the response from King George III is going to be quite swift. He's going to shut down the Boston Harbor and pass what's known as the Intolerable Acts. And it's going to be until the colonists are going to pay back every penny of the destroyed tea. So the port is closed. You also have the Justice, or the Administration of Justice Act, which is going to allow royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Great Britain and not in the colonies. And then you even have the expansion of the Quartering Act, allowing even more British troops into private homes. So this is going to now be applied to all colonies. So these were some of the major things that are going to go on. In addition, you're going to see the military governor for Massachusetts and martial law being declared, as you're going to see the law being enforced by the British military. So now they're not just having a presence there. So think about a lot of these events that we've just talked about. If you look at some of these images, here, of course, you have Ben Franklin's Join or Die cartoon that the colonies need to unite. Well, it's now no longer for the French and Indian War. We're now perhaps thinking about uniting against the British, that everybody has to be involved. And if we don't work as one collective unit, well, then you'll die. I mean, a very stark message. You even see some resistance on pottery, no Stamp Act. I mean, imagine feeling that strongly about something that you're going to put it on a piece of china, if you will. Here is a depiction, a cartoon of this is a place to affix the stamp. Of course, that's looking like death right there, encouraging, again, more discontent amongst the colonists. Here's a larger picture of the Boston Massacre, a great piece of propaganda by Revere. Here you have colonists protesting. You have an effigy. Sometimes they would hang them. Sometimes they'd set them on fire. So certainly that being agitated by the Sons of Liberty. Here you have a depiction of the Boston Tea Party. Here's another depiction of this as well. So again, you have a lot of discontent, and unity amongst the colonies is going to come a little bit closer together as we inch closer to the American Revolutionary War. So keep that in the back of your minds, that the seeds of discontent are growing and growing, and that this is very economic to a large degree, because the colonists are refusing to give any money back to Britain for quote-unquote protection. A lot of this stems from the French and Indian War. Also keep in mind, after the French and Indian War, this idea of salutary neglect is going away. You have a greater British presence, and trying to take away that freedom of colonists being able to control their own affairs, and you're going to take that away. That's going to be very, very difficult, as you'll see the colonists putting up quite a fight.